Hi, I'm Adrian, and today's video I wanted to talk about the statement that TechLead recently made about React Native. TechLead, if you haven't heard, is a YouTuber which does videos on development. He used to work at Facebook and Google, and recently he came out saying that React Native is garbage. Now, that's something I just don't agree with, and it really hurts me to hear him say something like this. I know that he used to work on the team with Facebook, and he would have even worked with some of the people that probably worked on React Native. There's a huge team behind there, and they work really hard. So I think saying something like that really doesn't value all the hard work and years they've put into the product. And to let you guys know, I haven't worked with the likes of Google or Facebook or some of these huge companies. I'm just a regular developer trying to get by, working with small to medium businesses. So that's where my opinion will be coming from. So the first point that TechLead brought up was the fact that big companies like Facebook or Instagram don't actually write their code fully in React Native. They just write it natively in iOS or Android, and this gives them a performance boost. But I guess from my point of view, not all organizations are as big as Facebook or as Instagram might have for their team. There might be small to medium businesses which might only have a development team of 1 or 2. And when you have a team that small, you can't afford to spend time to have an individual app all for iOS or all for Android. And React Native just makes the development much easier because you just write a single source of JavaScript and it compiles to both. And when I'm talking about smaller businesses, I don't mean just 1 to 10 people. I've worked on chambers and news organizations that have 300 staff or more, and they still don't have the money to invest in creating a team dedicated just for Android and dedicated just for iOS, and they have just a few developers to create something on React Native. There's a point made about large companies like Airbnb moving away from React Native, and then other companies like Shopify moving towards React Native. And while these are really good examples for large companies, you don't hear about what small companies are doing. Those things aren't in the news. And in my experience, most small companies are actually using React Native. It's much easier to get their development up and running, and the costs are so much lower. They don't have to worry about hiring a gigantic team for both developments if you're going to run it in vanilla. They can just have one team that knows JavaScript. They don't need 2 lots of the code working differently. They don't need 2 lots of the documentation. All of that's a big hassle and also a big cost. And if you have a look at the functionality, I think a lot of the code is cross-compatible. You're writing stores which basically function the same whether you're in React and React Native. And usually when I'm creating a store for a React web application and then I'm migrating to the React Native version, it's almost exactly the same. So I think that brings a lot of benefits. One of the points made was that normally you never only have React Native. You have vanilla code in there and you'll have different libraries you have to pull in, and it makes development difficult. But really, I don't think that happens for small to medium businesses. I definitely can understand that large businesses like Facebook and Google and Instagram will need to fight with those problems. But for a small to medium business, they just don't need to do that, and they can have their entire application in React Native. And yes, I can see how for very large apps, startup performance might be an issue. But personally, working with small to medium apps, this is usually not an issue, and most of them run pretty fast. React Native even actively works to improve startup performance by introducing things like Herms, which lowers the bundle size and improves the performance for any startup. TechLead points out that the job market for React Native isn't that great, but for me, I see the complete opposite in Australia. People aren't looking for native developers just for iOS or Android. They want someone that does everything. And in most cases, I see job applications for React Native. Recruiters are calling about them. They're always asking who to hire for that sort of work. And that's where things are going. In most cases, SMB will be looking for React Native developers, at least here in Australia. And outside of business and hiring, you also have the startup scene. They really benefit from React Native because it doesn't take that much investment to get up and running. And if you don't have much money, that's very useful. And if you're just trying to learn some new languages and you've learned HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you want to move over to React, then moving over to React Native isn't actually that hard. You'll understand mostly the syntax and it'll get you started with apps without too much difficulty. There's really good resources and documentation online, and I think that's a very big benefit that you don't get if you want to move over to Swift, for example, or the Android development cycle. iOS and Android programming is very different than what you're used to on the web, and if you're trying to get started on those, it's much more difficult to go through the tutorials because you essentially have to relearn everything. Whereas if you're coming in from React and JavaScript, you already have the fundamentals to get started. And I don't think it's fair to say that top talent exists only if you work on iOS or Android. I think talent can exist anywhere, whether it's in React Native or if you're working in vanilla. And it's not always that easy just to create an app in iOS and Android. Yes, you might be able to just hire two teams and you think, yeah, they'll get along. But really, sometimes they have competing points of view. There's usually a reason why someone works on Android and someone works on iOS. And sometimes it's a complete different mindset. So getting them to work together to create a unified product might be more difficult than it might seem. TechLead brings out that while the documentation is good for React Native, there are issues and cross-compatibility problems that you just might not see behind the curtains. And while that is true, that's true of any framework or language. What I really like to see is the fact that React Native are constantly working to upgrade their code and continue to bring out new features and functionality depending on what the people really need. I can hear that they listen to the community and they actively work to improve, which is something that I don't see in other languages sometimes. I can tell that React Native really cares about the community. Even with hot reloading, they gave you lots of different options so you could use what you needed for your application. And even now they've worked to improve and create fast reloading, which brings in all the benefits of all the past reloading systems, which is really great. React Native has a lot of potential. I've had some of the largest organizations in Australia call about jobs on them. I've had startups talk about them, and I've had companies that have never heard about them. And when I told them about them, they were on board. And not seeing the value that they bring to small to medium businesses is definitely a mistake. I think that there needs to be more discussion around how React Native is being used by just small companies. I wish there was more news about it, because then you might actually understand just how useful it is. So I really don't think React Native is garbage. I think that's a detrimental way to talk about any library or hardware from people. I think you might not agree with the use cases for large companies. I think there might be issues, but there's issues in any library, framework, or language. And I think what's important is the people behind it. If you really take a look at some of the people behind Facebook's React Native team, you can see that they're really dedicated, both to the community and to the product. And that's what I like to see. I hope you liked this video. I hope it's given you some insights into why I personally use React Native. Sure, it's not for everyone. Maybe it might be too small for big organizations, but personally I love it. So what do you think? Do you reckon React Native is garbage, or is that just a narrow mindset and there's a lot more to it? Do you agree with TechLead, or do you have some other opinions? Leave it in the comments below. I'm really trying to do more videos about content of React Native, React, and just development in general. So if you like this kind of content, if you want to see more like it, hit like and hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.